Welcome to the Momentum Flow podcast, where ideas, innovations, and experiences are shared to create continuous stream of inspiration and insight. Join me, your host, Luis Solana, a supply chain expert and investor, as I uncover how visionary founders, operators, and leaders are spotting opportunities, sparking innovation, and scaling profitable growth. From plan to cash, I bring real-world experience and an investor's eye to reveal how clarity, capital, and conviction fuel sustainable growth. Tune in and let's keep the momentum flow going. Welcome to the Momentum Flow podcast, where ideas, innovations, and experiences create a continuous stream of inspiration and insight. I'm your host, Luis Solana, a supply chain operator turned investor, exploring how visionary founders, operators, and leaders spot opportunities, spark innovation, and scale profitable growth. From plan to cash, I bring real-world experience and an investor's eye to reveal how clarity, capital, and conviction fuel sustainable growth. Tune in and keep the momentum flow going. Today, I'm joined by Jorge Titinger, a global CEO and board director whose career spans Silicon Valley technology, advanced manufacturing, and private equity-backed transformations. He's led organizations through growth, downturns, restructurings, and strategic pivots, bringing a unique combination of operational depth, people-centered leadership, and capital markets fluency. Jorge, as a former semiconductor operator and lifelong athlete, is known for fusing operational rigor with high-performance team culture, bringing a unique signature message. Cultural excellence is operational excellence. This conversation will explore how elite team behaviors, trust-driven cultures, and clear decision rights unlock supply chain reliability, speed, and strategic advantage. Jorge, I'm thrilled to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Luis. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the introduction. Just to add a little bit, I had the good fortune of playing college athletics. I played soccer. I'm South American, so it's kind of the only sport that we are good at. And from then, got recruited to play professionally, and then for the indoor national team. And frankly, that sports career, for lack of a better word, has had a significant impact on my leadership style and momentum. And I've brought a lot of those lessons into the business world. I had the opportunity to be a CEO twice in publicly traded global tech companies. And, like Luis said, like you said, I've been on multiple boards, continue to be on multiple boards, and work very closely with CEOs and business owners on helping them accelerate their growth and, like I call time, accelerate time to results. And given the topic, and I spent my career at the intersection of global operations, high performance teams, and the boardroom. And one of the things that has become very clear to me is that cultural excellence, and it really is operational excellence, and they kind of go hand in hand. The best supply chains in the world behave a lot like elite sports teams. They communicate fast, they trust each other, they adjust under pressure without losing alignment. So today I'm excited to talk about how leadership, clarity, and trust create real competitive advantage, especially in volatile environments. So let's go.
Excellent. Welcome, Jorge. So you lived in really three demanding worlds, right? The competitive sports, the global operations, and the boardroom. So let's start really at the intersection of those three. When you look at elite sports teams, and world-class supply chains, where do you truly mirror each other? Where do they truly mirror each other? But not conceptually only, but in day-to-day execution. Where do you see the similarities and the differences?
Yeah, great question. To me, they mirror each other in the way they operate under pressure, and that's through clarity, communication, and trust. On high performance soccer teams, Players move as a coordinated unit because they understand their roles and trust that teammates will execute their own, right? In world-class supply chains, the same is true. Reliability and is created not by heroics, although that happens a lot, right? But really seamless handoffs between people and shared awareness. And the teams that win are the ones that anticipate, communicate early, and adjust quickly without getting misaligned.
Eh, Excellent, excellent. I like how you frame it. Let's get a little deeper. You spend time in the locker rooms, you spend time with leadership teams, you spend time in boardrooms. What's
Mhm.
one lesson about performance under pressure that supply chain leaders consistently underestimate?
Yeah. To me, the biggest underestimated lesson is that bad news must travel fast, right? We we all get delighted on good news traveling fast, but where we really have an opportunity to make a change is when we hear about what's not going well quickly enough that we can adjust. In sports, if something's breaking down, you surface it immediately because the entire team depends on it, right? And one of the things I talk about in the world of sports is how feedback is instantaneous, right? All you need to do is look up at the scoreboard and you know if you're winning or losing. And in the world of business, and especially complex supply chains, complex product development, whatever that might be, sometimes it takes a long time to discover that you're headed in the wrong direction. So being able to surface what's not going well quickly, early, clearly is super important, and it's typically underestimated.
Yeah. So one thing that, and I know you for a while now, that you've always been curious about that culture isn't really a soft topic as people refer to it. It's more an operating system.
Mhm.
And when you think of complex multi-step operations,
Mhm.
how do you build discipline um, teams without drifting into micromanagement? And by teams, I mean more self-managed teams
Yeah.
than the micromanagement from the top.
Yeah, yes, it's great. Yeah, I have recently published an article that I called Think Like an Owner, right? And so I'm going to refer to this as owner-like teams. So you build owner-like teams by giving clarity on the outcomes and the boundaries and not by prescribing the method, right? So when people understand what truly matters and why, they step up with creativity, accountability, etc. And micromanagement actually creeps in when leaders confuse involvement with control. Real discipline comes from trust and transparency and consistent flow through, not control. And so I tell you, I've worked on both, teams where people just, this is their job, and teams where people really think like owners, and the difference is incredible, frankly.
In that same topic, is there an early warning sign that a leadership team immediately should reference or should observe if they cross that healthy accountability into a performance killing micromanagement?
Yeah, I think the first signs show up as hesitation, right? When people think that they need permission, um, they're gonna start optimizing for optics instead of impact, right? Is what do I look like? Is it okay to ask? Is it not okay to ask? If I ask for help, it's that a sign of weakness, etc. But when there's clarity of objectives and the behaviors and the boundaries are well defined, and people are really given the ability to actually operate inside of those, I think you see a significant acceleration of performance and results. But to me, that's the earliest warning sign is when people start hesitating and looking up to see, am I doing the right thing? Be careful. You might be getting misaligned in what your objectives are.
Excellent. As you know, my audience is heavily comprised by supply chain professionals, right? So from your board experience, what distinguishes companies that truly use supply chain as a strategic weapon versus those that still treat it as a back office function?
I think, the companies that make supply chain truly a part of the strategy from the very beginning have a much, much better chance of being successful, right? Um, I say the same thing, for example, about IT, they're in the,
Hmm.
especially nowadays, right?
Hmm.
But in the past, IT was, keep the phones running, keep the email running. And, when company really put these functions, supply chain, IT, in many cases, um, human resources as enablers of the business rather than just support organizations, they really have a competitive advantage. And there's very different companies from the perspective of their need for great supply chains, right? If I'm a software only company, my delivery to the market is very different than if I'm shipping actual product, let's say, where I need to buy raw material, process it, store it, ship it, install it, support it, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, even the supply chains that are coming in to support those software companies for their own operation could be very strategic. You know, if if you're hiring people and they have nowhere to work on, like no computers, in a company like that, that's going to create problems. So to me, again, back to the sports analogy, right? Every position has a purpose, and it's necessary, right? I mean, I use the example, from soccer. If the team was 11 goalies, it wouldn't be so good, right? They might not score on you, but you probably won't score either. So, elevate supply chain. Supply chain is critical into the strategic conversations of the company, and it will increase your chance of success.
Is there a specific misconception that you've seen in your board experience about supply chain readiness or capability? Anything that in general the boards have a misconception about?
I think the biggest misconception is that supply chain is purely operational, right? They underestimate how much of the performance depends on the culture of the company, right? The clarity of decision making, trust that is cross-functional. If those aren't strong, I don't know how much investing in systems, et cetera, can provide the resilience that the company will need. So,
So on that topic of culture, let me leave that there. So if you could only pick one cultural driver that matters most today, and it could be cross-functional trust, as you mentioned,
mhm.
or bias towards action, which would you pick and why?
I definitely pick cross-functional trust, and it accelerates everything. So one way to think about mistrust, and not necessarily in a heavy way, but if you need to be checking and watching everybody else's work, right? So, which is to me one of the things that show up as lack of trust. Um, think about it. You're inserting steps into your entire flow that are unnecessary, right? I mean, I use an example from when Toyota first implemented the Toyota system. Um, I don't think they themselves had imagined all the checking steps that they were able to eliminate when people were trusted to accomplish what they did and pass it on to uh, the next area in a very coordinated, very clear manner. Before, after every step, there was I need to check everything, right? And so they were able to reduce overhead by, the last time I remember reading something about it was like 6 times more than they thought they could. And I think the same thing could happen in more, regular supply chains. If you do have that trust, your necessity to be prudent goes down, and therefore time is not spent being prudent, time spent doing actual actionable work.
Yeah, perfect. And I totally agree with you that, and that's a great example. The you and I can keep up talking about culture as an operating advantage for hours. But let me pivot us
Mhm.
to the next section of our conversation about decision making and leading through volatility. You
Yeah,
know, Volatility, from my perspective, exposes everything, right? When there's volatility, you see process gaps, bad habits, bad
yeah,
culture, everything bubbles. So you led, through specifically your time in the semiconductor industry. You lead boom and bust, right? Cycles, so both of them. So
yeah.
arguably, semiconductors is one of the most unforgiving environments. So, what leadership behaviors matter most when volatility hits?
Yeah. Yeah, the semiconductor industry, certainly, if you look at, like you said, booms and busts, it looks like a roller coaster, right? Growing like crazy or shrinking like crazy. And I think the leaders that excel in volatile environments are the ones who have the ability to stay even keel, communicate early, and move with purpose. One of the challenges that I've seen with volatility is that it magnifies uncertainty. And people will always look for stability, right? So if you're somebody who can provide a level of stability inside of the world, in a world of uncertainty, that is something that's tremendously valuable. Leaders that can provide consistency, transparency, they lead teams that can focus on execution rather than speculation. One of the things I've observed during my career was that people always have the ability to paint a story that is more negative than it really is, or more positive than it really is, right? And so, if you as a leader are able to manage those ups and downs um, in a realistic and honest way, but with no panic, it makes a significant impact on the organization as a whole.
So you would argue that volatility is then a test of process or a test of culture or a test of both?
I think it's first a test of culture. I think, one of the things I discovered, I was in the semiconductor equipment industry for about 17 years, is your credibility as a leader truly got tested in the downturns, right? And we all know that culture comes from the top, right? The leaders actually establish it, maintain it, demonstrate it, um, you know, act in the same way, ritualize it, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but I'm not saying that process doesn't matter. Process matters tremendously, but volatility first exposes what people actually believe and how well they work together. And to me, that is part of my definition of culture, right? Is what people do, how they do it. If trust and alignment are weak, even the best processes will be threatened. Because they will collapse under pressure. People's, like I said, they'll put more pressure than necessary. And strong culture can adapt quickly. So if you have a strong culture and the processes aren't quite working because you may not have anticipated everything that is happening, you can adjust much more quickly than people don't have that trust, don't have that culture.
I totally agree with you that under crisis, under volatility, you need to have an even cool leadership to really manage that culture from the top and show it to the employees. At
Yeah.
the same time, sometimes you cannot just postpone decision making, right? Sometimes it's the other way around. You need to make rapid decision making.
Yeah.
So, can you share an anecdote, an experience, or a moment that you had to take a quick decision making and that really quickly improved execution or alignment?
Yes, absolutely. I have gray hair for all my years
I don't have hair, Jorge, so
in that industry, right? And I'll use an example. The you know product changes, by the way, in the semiconductor industry, um, the pace on innovation has gotten faster and faster and faster and faster. Like actually almost all technology industries, not just semiconductor. So you have to, I use the wording, it's probably not 100% accurate, but you kind of have to obsolete yourself every 12 to 18 to 24 months, right? And in this particular case, the product changes were stuck because no one knew who actually owned the final decision, right? So we had the marketing team doing, oh, this is what the customers need. The engineers are doing what they think they do best, which is innovate and create new things. They don't necessarily always align. The sales teams are saying, well, you might think that's what they want, but they're really buying this, et cetera, et cetera. And there was no clear owner, nor no clear methodology for ownership. And I've become a fan of a process that, I read about it first in the Harvard Business Review called RAPID. And RAPID stood for recommend, um, assess, perform, inform, and decide, right? And for every major decision that we had to make, we actually picked who has the D for decide.
Mhm.
Everybody else, anybody was wanting to recommend, to assess, of course, there was somebody who was assigned the performance of things. That's the P.
Mhm.
Um, but it really helped us explicitly deciding who was going to recommend, who had the decision, and we made it part of the way we worked, which was once the decision was made, unless there was brand new data, you could not go back and say, well, I didn't agree with that, right? And so you could disagree, but you had to align, right? Um, we had built a culture of significant trust. And so there were some wrong decisions, clearly, right?
Mhm.
But what gave us an advantage, if you will, was even when that happened, because of the trust that was in the organization, people could say, made a mistake, let's change courses, right? Without the repercussions of, the having it be a stigma to make a wrong decision. Now, if somebody was constantly making wrong decisions, other things
Yeah,
happen, right,
yeah, of
obviously.
course.
But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Hearing you speak, and I was reflecting on your comments in this last section, and my mind went back to sports. So because in sports, practice, training, repetition allows you to build that muscle, right? And
Hmm.
sometimes when you're trying to overcome volatility or crisis, you're trying to build that resiliency also in the operational side.
Hmm.
So what is your mind the equivalent of that practice in sports in the operational environment or in the board environment that builds that resiliency to be able to be ready when volatility hits on a crisis strikes?
Yeah. No, I think it's super important, right? And you know somebody said to me once, practice. 'Cause we all hear practice makes perfect, and I disagree. Practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect, right? And so you want to practice the right things. Um, and in sports teams, the best teams practice well, right? I the you hear all the stories, right, of all the greatest players in all sports were the ones who showed up before anybody else to practice and stayed after everybody else. And recently, I read that Roger Federer, arguably the greatest tennis player in history, he had only won 54% of his points. That's it, right? Think about it, right? And yet he, won probably most trophies of anybody else. We've all heard Michael Jordan say, I got so good because I failed so many times, et cetera. But it's hard to do in the world of business, right? So as much, one of the things I've always tried to recreate in my teams was this concept of practice, right? And so we created the things that we do, the daily huddles, the weekly reviews, postmortems or postpartums, depending on how you want to phrase it, scenario drills. We used to, when we looked at our strategy, we created, black and red teams. The black teams were supposed to be our allies, and the red teams were supposed to be our competition, and look at the strategy and try to poke holes in it. So all those things become a way for businesses to practice. And it's funny how so much of the verbiage has been borrowed from the world of sports, right? We talk about scrums, scrum is a rugby term, right?
Mhm.
Huddles, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's opportunities to to create practice-like scenarios at work. And like I said, let's make sure we're practicing the right things, because otherwise they become permanent.
Excellent.
For example, I led public companies, right? So we had every quarter to go have an investor call and our earnings calls, and we would gather executives from the company, some non-executives from the company, and do a dry run two, three times, have them ask tough questions, so that we were prepared when the actual real call was. That we actually, in many cases, we got tougher questions from our own people and the analysts. But I think it's important. I think it accelerates action.
Perfect practice. Yeah,
Mhm.
excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Jorge. And so let's just then pivot to this last section of our conversation around really moving from the discussion that we just had about building resiliency today to getting ready to what comes next in the future, right?
Yeah.
And you know, in today's world, not talking about AI is not talking at all. So as AI
Yeah.
enters into forecasting, into planning, into quality, uh, what mindset shift do leaders need to make, especially those leaders who grew up in, you know, in earlier times, in more deterministic times, of deterministic operating models with less variables, less dynamic. Uh, what are the what mindset shift do leaders need to make in this new environment?
Yeah. That's a great question, Luis. AI is becoming pervasive, or maybe it's already become pervasive, right? And I actually had the opportunity to be involved with AI literally since the mid 80s, right? Of course, generative AI is much newer, but AI has been around since 1962, actually. So I call it a 60-year instant success. But the big, and by the way, I've stopped calling it artificial intelligence, and I now refer to it as augmented intelligence, because I really think that the leaders that shift from AI being a replacement to being an enhancement and treat AI as another teammate are the ones that can actually um, do better, right? The technology can change fast, humans don't, right? And so AI accelerates insights, but humans still need to provide judgment. So the leaders who thrive will be the ones who stay curious, stay adaptable, and empower their teams to experiment with AI. I've heard just last week that 95% of the teams in businesses that are using AI are not seeing a return on their usage of AI. That's a massive disappointment, right? And so where I've seen success is when people actually embed it into their workflows and their strategy instead of just keeping it as a separate thing, and are very human in the way that they implement their AI.
What is the biggest gap on that assessment on because I share your frustration on not showing the results. Is it because skills or trust
Yeah.
or change readiness?
I think you'll get bored of my answers. I think it's cultural, right? I think specifically change readiness. As I said, technology can change very fast, right? People don't change that fast. And a lot of us, we trust our experience sometimes more than we trust just data. So we need to actually live it to feel not threatened by the AI, right? I've heard this from other people, but I truly was at a presentation. I get invited to talk about AI a fair amount, given my background with it. And somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, I'm very concerned that my job will be replaced by AI. And my answer, although I thought it was an original answer, but apparently many people have used it, it was that you shouldn't be threatened by AI. You should be threatened by the person who really knows AI. So
Mm,
get educated about it. Be conversant. Um, I think, one of the very positive things about AI is it truly democratizes our use of computers. You don't need to be a data scientist or even a data analyst to actually really take advantage of using computers. And of course, there's still a digital divide and all of those things, but it allows pretty much everybody to actually take advantage of the massive capacity and capability that AI brings. But we don't change at that velocity, as humans. And especially, you said, especially for leaders who are more of the kind of older style of leadership, I think there needs to be patience in the implementation of things, and always look at it from the perspective of how can it make things more efficient, which it does. How can it also how do you deal with the human side of things?
well,
Yeah.
Jorge, fantastic conversation, and you and I can continue talking for long, but we need to converge a little bit. So,
Mhm.
so you made it very clear how you think about a supply chain is only as strong as the trust between these people, right? And I fully agree. And you also made the point about high performance is not necessarily about speed, but about alignment.
Mhm.
Okay, so let me ask you a specific, maybe share an example or a specific moment in your career where that you remember that alignment made the big difference. You said like,
Yeah.
oh, we finally got aligned and we move forward.
Yeah. We had many moments like that, but one that comes to mind specifically is, in the semiconductor equipment industry, you build very expensive machines, yeah, with bills of materials in the tens of thousands of parts. And while you may have all the really critical stuff in place and have, assembled 98% of the tool, you're missing some, inexpensive fasteners, and guess what, right? You can't ship. So we had a quarter end crisis moment kind of like that, where the a supply issue, and it was a supply on a kind of ABC type components, was threatening a major shipment. And every function, engineering, operations, finance, sales, the actual supplier, we worked on, because they had run out of this particular part. We worked on a form fit function replacement that we were able to test quickly, that we were able to get the customer to agree because he was kind of really in a not that critical part of the machine. And what was beautiful is there was a single goal, which was not only for us, because of course, we wanted to be able to recognize the revenue at the end of the quarter, but delay for our customers was a delay in their time to revenue, right? And so they wanted the machine as soon as possible as well. And it was the beautiful thing is you typically, to get that kind of alignment, you need a rallying point. And in this case was the customer need. But the speed, the transparency, the unity across all those functions was really remarkable because, we couldn't just introduce a new part, right? It had to be qualified by engineering. It had to be procured. It had to be inserted. We had to do some level of testing. All of that flowed incredibly well. And again, the supply chain is not just the operation side, right? It's the whole, you said from order to cash, or, I used to talk about two meta processes in the companies, one of them being quote to cash. This was a great example of how that worked really well. And everybody was able to get aligned, and that's beautiful when you see that. And you see that, you see that in the world of music. You go to a concert, and when everybody's playing to the same sheet of music, it's a beautiful thing. You see it in sports, you see it in businesses. So I think we all should aim at achieving that kind of performance.
So at the end, you obtain trust and alignments, right?
Absolutely.
So so I end up every one of my conversations with guests with the same question to all of them. So for you, Jorge, what does keeping the momentum flow mean to you in leadership and personally in life? What does that resonate in your mind like?
Yeah. I'll start by saying it's not about moving faster. It's about moving together. So for me, momentum is about staying aligned, staying curious, and staying intentional. The leaders and teams who thrive are the ones that continue to learn, continue to adjust, and continue to move forward with purpose. I one of the things I talk about and I work with the executives that I work with in my consulting work is the levels of competence, right? From beginner to mastery. And you go from beginner to minimally competent, competent, expert, master. And I love to declare myself a beginner and open my mind to learn new things, right? And I think today, in the fast pace of technology shift and AI, excellent leaders who can actually open themselves to learning more about AI and how they can use it in their business, how they can stay human with AI, will have a great opportunity to succeed. So that's for me what it is. Momentum and flow to me mean moving forward, you know, up, conquering obstacles, et cetera. And to me, having the mind of a beginner is the best way to do it.
Okay, fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, frameworks, and real world leadership lessons. There were so many insights during this conversation. I captured a couple. Just uh, bad news must travel fast. Make sure they do. You need to think like an owner when you operate as teams. Trust, trust, trust. Uh, Obsolete yourself, that resonated to me. You need to aim for perfect practice, augmented intelligence, etc. There are so many insights and lessons from this conversation. Your experience across high performance cultures, global operations, and board level strategy is exactly the kind of perspective we aim to bring to this audience. So, Jorge, muchas gracias. Uh,
Yeah.
to the audience, if today's conversation sparked a new idea, challenged your perspective, or gave you a clearer lens into the future of operations, culture, and leadership, then this episode did exactly what we set out to do. Our mission here is very simple: to connect ideas, people, and technologies that are shaping the next generation of resilient, intelligent, and high performance supply chains. Momentum doesn't happen by accident. It's built through continuous learning, bold thinking, and leaders willing to push industries forward. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the series, leave a review, and share it with someone in your network who's building or transforming supply chain of their own. And if you want deeper insights, frameworks, and monthly essays, you can find them on my personal website, Luis J. Solana. You can connect with Jorge on LinkedIn. So once again, thanks for listening. And as always, keep the momentum flow going. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.